I never thought I'd be the kind of man who checks his wife's phone. For most of my life, I saw that as the ultimate sign of weakness, insecurity wrapped in paranoia. But weakness has a strange way of snaking in, disguised as instinct. You don't plan for it. It just happens quietly like rot under paint. Her name is Laura. We've been married 15 years. We live in a quiet suburb outside Portland, the kind of place where neighbors wave without meaning it, and the loudest sound at night is the hum of sprinklers. I'm 39 now. I run a small private security consulting firm, background checks, digital forensics, risk audits for mid-sized corporations. Nothing glamorous, but I'm good at it, good enough that clients trust me with their secrets. Maybe that's what made this sting so bad, because I knew exactly what secrets look like when they're buried. It started 3 months ago. Laura's job had been getting stressful, or at least, that's what she said. She worked at a logistics company downtown, handling vendor contracts. Long hours, sudden trips, late-night calls with suppliers. I didn't question it at first. She'd always been ambitious. But little changes began to show. Subtle ones. The perfume she stopped wearing for years was suddenly back. The password on her phone changed. The way she'd smile at nothing when checking messages. Instinct, not insecurity. That's what I told myself the first night I opened my own investigation. I didn't touch her phone. I didn't need to. Her laptop at home was synced with her cloud storage, and buried in that endless tangle of work documents and grocery lists, I found a folder named Archive 2, hidden, but not encrypted. Inside were dozens of images, screenshots, chat logs. A man's name kept appearing, Mark R. At first, it looked professional. Project updates, scheduling notes, small talk about shipment delays. But then came the after-hours messages, ones where the punctuation got lazy, the tone softer. Then the first message that changed everything. Mark, you were incredible today. I can't stop thinking about it. Laura, you shouldn't. We said we'd keep work and that separate. I stared at that word for a long time. I didn't feel anger, not yet, just a strange numbness, like the moment right before pain kicks in. I closed the laptop, poured myself a whiskey, and sat in the dark living room until the glass was empty. The next morning, I smiled at her like nothing had changed. If you've ever been betrayed, you know there's a phase where you almost convince yourself it's not real. You build stories, excuses to keep your world from collapsing. Maybe he's just a friend. Maybe she's venting. Maybe she's playing along to protect her job. But deep down you already know. I started digging deeper. Mark worked for a subcontractor I'd never heard of, Nova Systems, supposedly providing data management for Laura's company. No online presence. No employees listed on LinkedIn except a few ghost accounts. Something was off. When I ran his email domain through a trace program, it led to a private server registered to a shell company in Nevada. That's when my professional instincts overrode the personal. This wasn't just cheating. This was structured deception. I decided not to confront her. Not yet. You can't win a war until you know the terrain. The following week, Laura told me she was heading to Seattle for a 3-day conference. I kissed her goodbye at the airport, pretending to believe every word. The moment her flight left the ground, I got to work. Through a contact at the airport's private security division, I obtained access to the surveillance network. Not legal, but I wasn't exactly worried about legality anymore. I traced her through the concourse, expecting to see her board. She did in single quotes d. Instead, she met him, Mark, tall, dark coat, unhurried confidence. They walked right past gate B-17, where her flight was supposedly boarding, and into a side terminal for private charters. They kissed, slow, familiar, the kind of kiss that only comes after months of routine. Then they got on a plane I didn't recognize. No airline markings. No records of its departure in public databases. Just one word stenciled on its tail, Nova. For 3 days, she didn't answer my calls. When she came back, she looked radiant, rested, glowing, almost alive. She hugged me like a stranger trying to remember what affection was supposed to feel like. "Conference went great," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "I think it'll lead to some new contracts." I watched her talk, my heart a quiet fist in my chest. "You deserve it," I said, smiling. That night, while she slept, I copied her phone data using a wireless extractor. Every message, every location ping, every hidden app. By morning, I knew more about her than she probably knew about herself. And that's when the betrayal turned into something else: curiosity. Because what I found wasn't just an affair, it was a connection to something far bigger. The texts between her and Mark mentioned clients, transfers, and delivery windows. Not the language of lovers, the language of deals. I decrypted attachments that looked like shipment manifests, coordinates, cargo weights, and encryption keys. One file in particular caught my eye: Tessera. It was locked, military-grade encryption. But I had tools. When I finally cracked it, my blood went cold. It wasn't about love or sex or boredom. It was about money, about data theft, about black market transactions tied to companies I'd worked with before, some of them federal contractors. Laura wasn't just cheating on me. She was helping steal from classified clients through her company's network. I sat there in the dark again, same chair, same whiskey. But this time, the numbness didn't last up, because now it wasn't just betrayal, it was treason. I could have gone to the authorities. I could have confronted her. But I didn't. Something inside me shifted that night. Something old, something cold. You can't spend years uncovering people's secrets without learning how to make them pay for it. And Laura, my wife, had just made herself the perfect target. I started planning her routines, her passwords, the accounts she didn't know I'd already mirrored. Every place she'd hidden the truth, I'd be there first. If she'd spent all this time weaving lies, I'd pull the thread until her world unraveled. Not with rage, but precision. Quiet, methodical, merciless precision. Because when love dies, there's only one thing left worth saving: control. And I intended to take it all back. The world changes when the person you trusted becomes your lead suspect. People who once seemed familiar acquire angles you hadn't noticed: the way her hand flutters when she lies, the phrase she uses to deflect, the tiny rituals that hide anything from a partner paying attention. I learned those rituals quickly. Attention is a weapon when you know how to use it. I told myself I would be surgical. No yelling, no public scenes, no threats. Evidence first, a conviction of truth. Whatever came after would be an outcome of skill, not rage. Day one, I consolidated everything I had harvested: her messages, the flight logs, the Tessera manifest and its fragments, the Novotel code from the private jet. I labeled folders with dates the way I used to label evidence: clean, chronological, immutable. Paper keeps you honest. Then I called 3 old favors. The first was Andre, a field tech I'd used years ago when a client needed a fast, quiet forensic sweep. Andre had a face for coffee and a network for trouble. He could ghost a ping or open a closed door without asking for too many details. He went with me to the airport database under the pretense of research, and in an hour he pulled manifest fragments that confirmed the tail number I'd seen. Nova Systems was not a contractor in good standing. It was a private logistics show with a legal footprint thinner than cigarette paper. The second favor was Lena, a contact at a small investigative magazine. She owed me because once I'd fed her a story that cost a corrupt developer his license. She didn't ask what I intended. She asked where and when. That hunger, journalists who still remembered why they became journalists, is a good kind of hunger to have on your side. The third favor was the one I kept in reserve: a ghost account at the private security exchange where contractors trade bits of black market work. I'd never used it publicly. It was a tool I kept like a last bullet. Through that account I pulled a name that kept coming up in Nova's chat of a company they subcontracted to: Tessera Logistics. Tessera wasn't a company you found by Google. It was a directory in a very specific ecosystem. If you know the ecosystem, Tessera's behavior is a pattern you recognize. Irregular pickups, armored vans listed as art transport, contracts routed through nonprofits. The coup that cinched it for me was a series of payments that terminated in a trust account registered to a man named Garrett Mallet. He had the kind of resume that looks boring on paper: investor, small-time trustee, clean civic associations. Men like Garrett are good at policing their faces. I built a map that afternoon. Lines between emails and phone numbers. Dots where physical pickups occurred, arrows where payments shifted through shells. My hands moved with the muscle memory of years in the business. It gave me a small, dangerous comfort. That night I followed Laura. Not stalk in the melodramatic, movie sense way, no hiding in bushes, no breath held in alleyways. I sat in my car 3 blocks from her office and watched the exits. I recorded faces, number plates, times. She left at 6:05. She walked to a car with tinted windows and a driver who walked with the gait of a man used to avoiding attention. The car drove, turned, and stopped at a strip of warehouses on the riverfront. I logged the coordinates. I didn't go in, not then. You only go into a place that could destroy you if you've already got a plan to leave. Instead, I set a pattern. My presence where she would expect nothing. My devices where they would pick up what she wouldn't think to hide. The next day, with Andre and a small rig of low-cost reconnaissance gear, I returned to the dock. We set a few cheap motion-activated cameras that looked like trash and a GPS bug sweep behind a sign. The cameras looked for movement. The bugs looked for signals. Both are honest when treated well. The footage that night was small but precise. A covered truck, plain plate, arrived at 9:45 p.m. Two men unloaded black cases the size of instrument trunks and stacked them carefully on a pallet. They recorded serial numbers on clipboards. A third man signed a handheld pad and then left with a sealed envelope. The truck left at 10:22 and drove to an address in an industrial park 2 exits away, a leasing agent's name on the pad. Unit 17B. Arkwright Logistics. Arkwright wasn't on any of the lists I recognized. That was the point. Companies that want to be invisible are invisible because they build themselves on other people's visibility. The driver's plate, however, traced back through a show company to an armored courier that did legitimate business for art dealers. The more I dug, the more I saw the same pattern. Legitimate face, clandestine back channel. I started to see Laura's role. On paper, she approved invoices, matched shipment manifests, and confirmed client codes. That was her cover. In reality, she inserted keys, encryption, handshakes, routing codes, dummy manifests that allowed Tessera to repurpose shipments and move data and people without red flags on the main chain. It was elegant, criminal, and, the worst, efficient. But the heart of the matter, the hinge, was Garrett Mallet. He paid for disappearance services through trusts and charities that scrubbed public trails. That's how you get officials to look away. Give them paperwork that passes smell tests. Garrett's name appeared in donations to local civic trusts that routinely received anonymous benefactors. I found receipts where a nonprofit accepted a private contribution and then wired a sum to a logistics provider. Charity laundering is the oldest trick in the book. By week 2, I knew enough to be dangerous, enough to pull one thread and watch the fabric tear. I also knew enough to get someone who could move fast if the fabric began to smoke. Lena agreed to give a soft nudge to a story about missing freight and unexplained courier gaps that would open a small review by local reporters. Not yet accusations, only questions. Questions are knives when placed carefully, but this wasn't just about exposure anymore. Exposure can be paper thin. People with pockets deep enough can buy time. What I needed was something tangible, proof that Tessera's cargoes contained controlled items, or that people had been moved through channels with the explicit intent to disappear them. To get that, I needed to intercept a shipment. Sting planning is a dull, tedious math. You list possibilities, probabilities, and contingencies. My contingency list was long: legal risk, physical danger, Laura's safety. I built fail-safes like a paranoid engineer. Andre stood at my shoulder as we coded paths between option and fatality. He'd been smuggled into worse and had never blinked. That steadiness helped. We picked a night. A freight schedule from Arkwright showed a run to an address near the old quarries, a long drive where cameras were sparse and cell coverage lumpy. If Arkwright was doing one of their off-books runs, that's where it would be. We weren't alone in the planning. I'd seeded a decoy in Laura's system, a dummy manifest that suggested an urgent meeting in the morning and asked for a confirmation call. That would tug one of the men who moved goods, someone in the operation with hands in the loading. If he took the bait and went to confirm, we'd have a window. At 2:00 to the truck left Arkwright under cover of drizzle. Andre stayed in the van a half-mile down, pinging our planted bugs. I trailed at a distance, phone hot, heart steady. The truck slowed at the quarry turn, flicked its hazard lights, and pulled into the lot. 2 men unloaded the same black cases we'd seen before. They were methodical, professional, and nervous. I thought of pulling a gun, of cutting the scene into instant drama, but those are moves of desperation. I had something better: documentation and backup. I moved forward with a comms relay so the live feed would go straight to Lena's newsroom and to an encrypted server where copies would be safe. If anything happened to me, the proof would still speak. When I approached, the men were surprised but not shocked. Business like this teaches people to expect trouble. One reached under his jacket, the universal motion that makes a man's spine prickle, and I heard metal. He had a firearm. Colder than a kiss. "Don't," I said. My voice was calm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I want to know who signs for these shipments." They ignored me and checked IDs. One flashed a card for Barton Security Solutions. It was the name I'd seen on the invoices. Barton. The man with the gun was a subcontractor, not the mastermind. He laughed when I asked about the cases. "You don't know whose business this is." Walk away? I did not walk away. Instead, I did what I do best. I bought the moment. I asked a question that could be Googled later, that would give them the false confidence that this was a small, local sting. I said, "Who pays Barton for Arkwright runs? Which trust?" The man sneered, but the second man, younger, maybe 27, sweat on his upper lip, hesitated. "We get paid by Mallet Trust," he muttered. "Instructions come with the invoice." It's not our job to ask. There it was, a name. Not a person who could be arrested immediately. Not a politician, but a channel. I stepped back and called Lena. "They've mentioned Mallet Trust," I whispered into the phone. "Live now." Our voice came the way it always did when we'd done something reckless, sharp and focused. "Rolling," she whispered too. The feed went live to her producer and to the number I'd given Andre. The men saw the cameras then. The dynamic changed from hostile to transactional. People who do crimes in daylight do not like cameras. They prefer ghosts. The leader cursed and waved them off. The truck left. The men melted into the gray. We had cases on camera, men admitting a trust name, a driver's plate, a direction of travel. It wasn't proof enough to indict, but it was a bonfire that would force a reaction. Men like Garrett Mallet don't like bonfires. Back at the van, Andre and I watched the feed until the file uploaded and multiple encrypted copies distributed. I felt the old rush again, fear braided with purpose. The hunt had teeth now. The machine had to respond. We had triggered something. I sensed it the way you sense a predator shifting. Within 48 hours, Laura's office was audited. Anonymous calls came to her HR. Garrett's trustees denied involvement and asked for privacy. Barton Security shifted routes. And somewhere, someone lit a clean candle. "If this goes wrong," Andre said low, "it goes very wrong." "I know," I said. "But if it goes right, we find the ledger. We find Tessera's contracts. We find Mallet." We slept little that week. I dreamt of manifests and black cases, and of Laura standing in a hotel elevator, her hand inside the crook of a stranger who knew her beyond the ledger's entries. The hunt had stripped me down to a single shape, a man willing to burn his life to buy the truth. We were still far from the center, far from the names in the trust documents. But the net was narrowing. In a game of shadows, you force people to move, then watch where they step, and when they step, you strike. The next move would be harder. It would require contact with someone inside Mallet's circle. It would force a betrayal I was not eager to make. But this was no longer just about an affair or stolen data. It was about stopping a machine that erased people when they inconvenienced those who had money and appetite enough to buy silence. The hunt was no longer a private ritual for my grief. It was a countdown. I checked the file again. Tessera, Operation Tessera, and for the first time since I opened the laptop in my living room, I felt close enough to touch the truth. I felt close enough to make the next move. When the hunt acquires teeth, it starts to hurt you as much as it hurts them. We thought the bait at the quarry would force a reaction and light a path to Mallet. It did, just not in the neat, prosecutable way I'd imagined. Instead of a clean unraveling, Arkwright rerouted. Barton disappeared for a day, and the truck started using alternate lots. The men we caught on camera muttered names and shrugged. They were small, replaceable parts. The machine moved on without missing a beat. That's how these things work. Power doesn't live in one man. It lives in an arrangement. Cut one head off and to more hold the next steady. Still, for a brief, stupidly bright instant after the quarry footage hit Lena's feed, I felt like I'd cracked something. Comments started to trickle in, tips from a trucker who recognized a plate, a scrap of an invoice some accounts clerk had kept for the wrong reason, an offhand note from a board member who'd been embarrassed by a private donation. Nothing prosecutable by itself, but all of it glue you save for when you need structural evidence. We began to stitch the glue into a rope. Andre worked miracles, turning scraps of intercepted comms and the jammer logs into plausible chain of custody documents. Lena's team pushed small, targeted pieces to an editor who knew how to ask unnerving questions without screaming headlines. The trick was to keep them from being suppressed, published slowly in different outlets, across jurisdictions. You make the story 1,000 small aches instead of a single explosive roar. People in power are good at extinguishing fires. They're not good at answering 1,000 quiet complaints. But while we built the rope, someone else started plotting a countermeasure. The first sign wasn't a threat or a dead drop. It was subtle, a behavioral shift in Laura I couldn't account for. She grew distant in a different way, less like someone under fear, and more like someone rearranging her face to fit a new mask. She'd been honest with me about parts of Obsidian. She'd told me things no wife should have had to tell. Yet now, when I brought up the ledger or asked about Mallet, she'd pivot with a small joke, a deflection I recognized from interrogation rooms. That pivot was not the sign of innocence. It was a practiced dodge. One rainy evening, Andre and I sat outside a diner near the docks, watching an empty street. The rain made the sodium lamps smear gold. He slid a paper across the table, a hit list of shell companies and transfer nodes he'd traced in the last 48 hours. At the bottom, someone had scrawled a note. Check Laura's vendor list for match to Mallet Trust beneficiaries. My pulse tightened. She volunteered that info, I said. She handed me Ardent files. Volunteered, or delivered, Andre said. People like her don't hand you the keys unless they want you to use them and then to stop. Or they hand you a bait so you step where they want you to. I pictured her at the pier, at the warehouse, the small nails she'd hammered into the ledger. I pictured the look on her face when she said they used me to make a weapon. Was that a confession or a manipulation? It's a rotten thing to suspect your own spouse of playing both sides. It changes the geometry of a life. But you learn, in this work, to follow the cold vector of evidence even when it leads to the place your heart quietly refuses to tread. We started surveillance on her contacts. Not to shame her, though shame's a useful tool, but to protect her if she was a target, and to catch her if she was a vector. The first few days turned up routine meetings, dinners with men who called her Laura with firm, comfortable authority. The second week, we saw the oddities. Encrypted messages at midnight, a payment to a floral shop that, when traced, funneled into a trust account in the Caymans. Phone pings that blinked off grid for minutes at a time when she was in conference. Patterns. And patterns are how you prove intention. The fracture came on a Tuesday. Andre had secured a lead from a mid-level accountant who'd worked for one of Mallett's charities. He'd been a former client of mine, someone who'd been careless with loyalty and had alibis expensive enough to be boring. He called in a trembling voice and gave a location. A storage facility north of the river where donation shipment would be consolidated before being moved. The manifest listed audio-visual equipment. We knew what that meant in this world. Cases, drives, devices with stripped serials. We drove in a van with fake company plates. 2 reporters in back, Lena on a hotspot and Andre on comms. The storage yard was on a dead-end road, flanked by scrub and fading industrial signs. At dusk, a black van rolled in. 2 men with faces like tarmac-lined, practical and loaded cases. One of them scanned a device that blinked, and then, as if on cue, the yard lights died. Total blackout. That's Ardent's signature. Kill the cameras. Move in the dark. Leave no witness. Except we had redundancies. Andre's bug had piggybacked on the van's own onboard diagnostics. We logged a simulated GPS trail of the van's route. We had one camera farther down the block that hung from a rusty pole, solar panel half broken but capturing silhouettes against the sky. We recorded the license. We had names, a courier, a clerk, a trustee who'd signed the manifest. We followed. The van went to a private dock and then to a ferry I thought had been decommissioned. It crossed, and on the other side it stopped at a manor with coal hedges and a gate that opened without a guard. That's when I understood Garrick Mallett's genius. The outer layer is charity and civic benevolence. The inner layer is a network of gated safe houses. He used civic endowments as a cloak, and men like Barton and Arkwright as his hands. We watched dock workmen carry cases into a basement lab. The lab smelled like solvent and bleach. It was clinical. They were meticulous. Drives catalogued, labels scrubbed, devices put into Faraday bags. If you were a person inside those drives, you'd be gone in a way that left a paper trail impossible to reconcile. I felt the ear thin. The stakes were appended from figure out what they were shipping to they are shipping people. That night, back at the van, my phone buzzed with a message that made me stop breathing. Unknown. Stop digging. You don't have to die tonight. No number, no signature. A simple threat, but a precise one. Someone had watched us. They had ways to reach us. They had placed a warning inside the net we'd built. I slept in the van that night, partly to deny my home the information of our movements. The city beyond the windows went on with its indifferent choreographed nightlife. Inside the vehicle, the future rearranged itself into a map of risks. We pressed anyway. 3 days later, Andre brought a file into the safe house like a man carrying an animal he couldn't kill quickly. He pushed it across the table, face pale. It's worse, he said. There's a ledger, not just names, but pre-approval tags, neutralized pending, legacy asset. They used language like that. And the kicker, one of the tags lists dates that match Laura's expense approvals. Not as an approver, her signature is in the log. She has access to the ledger. My hands went numb. Access does not equal intent, I said, because I needed to believe it even while the opposite lodged like a stone in my chest. Andre's eyes were hard. There's an audit trail. Her account pushes a confirmation packet that triggers the rerouting function. Someone on her machine has to authorize the transfer. It could be coercion, it could be collaboration, but the system records her key. The fracture unsettled more than a professional bone. It cracked my moral spine. If she'd authorized transfers, Had she signed away the lives of names that possibly included people I'd once called colleagues? Had she been a cog who thought a knob would keep the gears from biting her? Or had she used her access to help us, to insert the bait we'd needed? I slept very little. The safe house gave me solace in its anonymity, but not in its answers. I replayed our conversations, searching for old alarms I hadn't heard. I tried to reconcile the woman I'd love with a signature on a ledger that whispered death. Love is not a shield against evidence. It's a lens that sometimes narrows focus until all you see is the thing you want. The next move had to be precise. If Laurel was a collaborator willing or coerced, we needed to find proof that split her intention from her action. If she was a target, we had to extract her from the ledger's reach before the neutralized pending became reality. I called Lena, asking for her newsroom's most discreet operation, a timeline reconstruction, interviews under pseudonym, legal affidavits placed before the press in safe jurisdictions. She said she could get flashes of attention in Cyprus and in Stockholm, where different regulatory bodies might freeze financial flows. That would slow the machine. Andre could get a physical copy of the ledger if we could bait someone with proximity, someone small enough to be greedy and not careful enough. So we made a plan that required more risk than I cared to list aloud. Use Laura as a lure one last time, but in a way that would reveal whether she moved out of fear or profit. She would attend a client dinner at a restaurant near the river. Mallet's men would likely use the same venue to move messages. If we could get them on camera, if we could intercept an envelope, if we could force a confession from a small player like a courier or a clerk, it would tell us what we needed. I told Laura the truth, everything. Not all at once. The way you tell a person you're trying not to break is careful. I told her the quarry video, the duck tracking, the ledger. Her face drained. She said nothing for a long time. Then she asked, "Will you protect me?" I thought of all the ways to answer that question. To promise is simple. To deliver is not. "I'll try," I said. The night of the dinner, I sat 2 tables away, watchful, heart a metronome. The restaurant hummed with polite laughter and clink of glasses. Men and women in suits moved like sharks who pretended to be swans. Laura arrived, composed, and sat across from a man I'd never seen, balding, well-fed. Washed the room like someone counting votes. Midway through the meal, the man excused himself and returned with a corded envelope. He slid it across to Laura, fingers barely brushing paper. She palmed the envelope and tucked it into her bag with a practiced motion. My throat closed. That motion, so practiced, told me most of what words could not. I waited until she left the table to go to the restroom. At that moment, I moved. I followed at a distance and watched as she stopped in the hallway. The envelope was out. She opened it, and inside was a folded paper and a small card with a number. The paper had a name spelled out in initials and a date. My name, not a threat. An appointment. She didn't expect me to step from the shadow. When I did, she didn't jump. She looked at me with a small, broken serenity. "What do you want?" She whispered. "Answers," I said. I said it like a man who had taught himself to hold back the eruption. She took a breath. "You won't like them. Try me." She closed her eyes. "They told me I could protect us. I believed them at first, but last week they said if I didn't authorize the transfer, the ledger would mark both of us. They showed me," her voice broke. "They showed me a file with your name and a date. They said if I didn't confirm, they'd mark you as asset." I felt the floor tilt. "Then why the envelope tonight?" I said. She looked at me as if measuring my capacity for pain. "Because if I refuse, they'd take my daughter's school account. They asked for continuity payment streams for trust funds. They gave me a kill switch and called it insurance. I thought I could play them. I thought I could feed them crumbs and keep the ledger from marking names. I was wrong. The fracture inside me split into many thin pieces. Protective instinct warred with the scent of betrayal. I wanted to strike, to destroy the little man's face in the hall. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. Who is he? She mouthed the name. Mallet has a lieutenant, the man at dinner, Peter Haynes. He ran logistics for an NGO until last year. He signs the invoices. He's small, stupid. He's replaceable. She closed her eyes. But the ledger is not his to own. He just pushes the buttons. Then we take Haynes, I said. Find out who he answers to. Force him to talk. She nodded, afraid and resolute. If you do this, there's no going back, Daniel. There never had been. We went back to the van with plans, and with the knowledge that the fracture had widened into something that could not be put back together. The ledger had my initials on it, and my wife had authorized packets that accelerated transfers. Whether she'd been forced or had fooled us both, the truth was now a splintered thing we would have to pry out with tools and patience. Outside, the city carried on lights, cabs, the indifferent commerce of human lives. Inside me, the fracture had opened into a canyon. The man who had been betrayed and the man who would take revenge had reached a fork. One way led to courts and slow judgments, the other to direct action, personal risk and likely blood. I thought of the ledger, of names like ghosts trapped in drives. I thought of Laura's hand, of the practiced motions, of the envelope with my name. I thought of Mallet and his trusts. I thought of how the system always eats the small and protects the large. Andre cleaned the footage and cued the calls. Lena scheduled the leak to a European desk that could publish and hide simultaneously. I set a time to move on Peter Haynes. We lit 3 separate pots of pressure at once, because that's the only way to bring down a machine. Attack it on multiple axes until its integration fails. At 2:17 a.m., Andre sent a single text. Ready. I sat on the van's hood, the night air pinpricking my skin. I typed back, ready. And then we stepped into the fracture with our eyes open, knowing some things never meant. We moved like animals with a single prey in sight, careful, patient, and dangerous when cornered. The plan for Haynes had been simple in theory and lethal in its dependencies: photograph, intercept, and force him to talk. In practice, it required timing, luck, and the steady hands of men who didn't flinch when things went sideways. Andre was steady. Lena was hungry. I was a man reduced to one currency: consequence. We set up across the street from the little bistro where Haynes had a habit of taking clients, a place that smelled of garlic and the sea, with a thin velvet rope of regulars and a doorman who liked to score the reputations of businessmen. Haynes arrived exactly on time, suit and tuck just so, eyes the color of musky paper. He sipped wine like a man who had practiced vulnerability. In the mirror, he didn't look like someone who knelt over ledgers. He looked like the sort of man content to let other people dirty their hands. The trick when you spring a human trap is to let them believe they're the clever one. So we fed Haynes his mirror. Lena's producer had phoned the table with a Fox emergency story. The senior editor's contrived need for a source who'd signed off on an anonymous transfer. Haynes's liaison, predictably cautious, excused himself and took the call outside. He left Haynes alone with 2 other men, small men, nondescript, the sort who do the dirty work so the big players can dine and sleep easy. I slipped into the booth behind them, under the guise of a late-arriving patron. My camera was a small thing, tucked in the cuff, lived to Lena's back end. Andre watched the van 2 blocks away, ready to move. We had 3 extraction plans, 2 legal buffers, and a checklist of contingencies. You learn to prepare because improvisation in this business is just another word for dying fast. When one of the men reached for the wine bottle, I moved. My hand was steady as a surgeon's. I knocked the bottle. The splash orchestrated to pin down everyone's attention. In the chaos, I slipped a note into Haynes's pocket, a note with a single line and a camera pointed at his hands. Then I laughed. You don't confront a man with a ledger face-to-face inside a restaurant and expect to walk away. You break the rhythm, create an aftershock. It's a small cruelty. It's effective. The note said, "We can talk tonight, 11:30. Pier 12, come alone." Haynes read it and laughed at first like a man who believed he had friends to surround him. Then he looked up and saw the camera lens in the reflection of the glass. Far too late. He caught my eye for a second, the width of a blade, and I saw worry creep into his face. It was the same look Rains had worn the night his world started to tremble. Not yet panic, but the knowledge that someone had put a finger on where the bones met. At 11:22 we were at Pier 12. It was a low-tide night and the pier smelled of diesel and old rope. The harbor lights blinked like tired stars. I had a small flashlight, a recorder, a microphone, and a pocket of things you only show when you mean to keep someone alive, just long enough to talk. Haynes came alone, late, in a jacket that didn't quite cover the flinch. He kept glancing over his shoulder like a man expecting a procession. When he saw me, he tried to square a smile into his face, the kind of smile that says you are never afraid. It never works. "You're a brave man," he said. "I'm a man with questions," I corrected. "Answers would be better." He folded his hands like a child. "Look, this is a mistake. I don't know what you think I know." He was trying already to buy confusion. "You told Laura she could have continuity," I said. "You provided her a kill switch, and you called it insurance." "Why?" He swallowed. For a second, his hands trembled. "It's absurd, the things that make a strong man break. The look in someone's eye, the quiet steadiness of a recorder on, the sound of your name on a file with the word neutralized next to it." He knew we had evidence. He knew I wasn't bluffing. "You don't get it," he said finally. "There are operations. There are contracts. Sometimes collateral is collateral. It's ugly, but it's commerce. Commerce." I spat. "People are dying." He flinched as if I'd hit him. I don't make policy. I sign forms. I coordinate logistics. You know how this works. You worked for Grayson. You designed the pathways. You know how a shipment can be repurposed. I designed protections," I said. "You perverted them." His voice broke then, not with contrition so much as with the existential fatigue of a small man in too big shoes. "They're not wrong to want to control liabilities. Money buys stability. Stability means fewer lawsuits, fewer leaks, fewer things that make men with assets uncomfortable. Your job is to move boxes and lives," I said. "You made yourself complicit." He looked at me with sudden, childish fear. "If I tell you who's above me, maybe they'll bury me. They don't let leakages like this go. Dave," his voice shuddered, "they'll kill me if I talk." "Then talk to save your life," I said. "That's the deal." He breathed, then told me what I already suspected in better detail. Mallet was the visible face of a trust network. His people sat on boards, donated to charities with specific beneficiaries, and used shell accounts to funnel payment for asset management. Barton moved the hardware. Arkwright moved the crates. Tessera handled the rerouting. Haynes was the signatory, the practical man. He signed and folded. He feared the gardener above him. "So you're just a signer," I said. "You feed forms into a machine that spits out quietness." He nodded. "I'm small. They like people like me because I do as told." Then, like a man who had been thinking about this for a long time, he added, "You should be careful, Hayes." They noticed persistence. It was the first real fear I'd seen in the operations inner circle. Men like Haynes are the lubricants of an engine. They're replaceable, but they also know where the engine's oil goes. He gave me 2 names and a way to contact a supplier who'd moved a recent shipment to a secondary cache, a place where drives and, occasionally, assets waited before being eradicated. He gave me the name with the same dread of a man handing over a loaded gun to someone who might point it back. Then he asked for protection. "If I cooperate, I want assurances," he said. "Witness protection, relocation." I told him I couldn't promise safety, only the truth. He trembled and laughed, which is what weak men do when they're cornered by consequence. We left Haynes at dawn and handed the contact, and recorded confession to Lena. She smiled, the merciless smile of someone who knows what a story will cost the guilty. Andre set his networks quietly. Things were about to get very loud in the right rooms. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then the first strike came. I was at home trying, in a small, practical way, to keep up appearances for a few hours. The ring of the doorbell was a sound I'd come to hate. I opened the door to find a courier with a package addressed to me. It was heavy and unmarked. Inside, a single Polaroid. Me, asleep on the couch. My face bloodless, my eyes closed. On the back, in a handwriting I'd seen before but couldn't place, a single sentence scrawled, "Stop. You don't get threats like that from amateurs." This was professional intimidation. The people who sent it wanted me afraid enough to stop, and precise enough that they knew where I slept. It was a warning and a promise. I left the Polaroid where it was and went to Andre's. 2 men beat me there, or maybe they had been waiting. Whatever the case, they were not ordinary suits, eyes like pennies, hands that never twitched. They spoke not with threats but with businesslike advisories. "We don't want blood," one said. "We want balance. You and your wife make a mess of things that belong to people who prefer their work be invisible. Leave it alone." I could smell the cologne of men paid to say polite words. I told them I'd heard enough. They left. They were not bluffing, and that ought to have been the damper on my ardor. Instead, it was the fuel. Threat doesn't always make men stop. Sometimes it makes them act. After they left, Laura and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the newspaper between us like a third, accusing presence. The paper's headline was small but vicious. Local logistics under scrutiny. Charitable donations questioned. Their lawyers were already circling. "I can't keep us both going on this edge," she said. Her eyes had dark circles, the hollow fatigue of someone living with an open wound. "You shouldn't have dragged me into Haynes. You were already in," I said. I only pulled the curtain a little wider. She put her head in her hands. "They've been careful. I thought if I did what they wanted, they'd leave you alone, and were you believe?" I asked. She looked up. "Maybe at first, then they tightened the noose. It's always a noose with them. The ledger updates, and they say we only keep order here. I didn't know what would happen when you started pulling threads." The house felt small, like the last room in a dying theater. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent song. Inside, a man and a woman and the choices they'd made sat with the knowledge that people with power give you small mercies, until they don't. We had to move faster. Lena's pieces were circulating. The public inquiry had sparked questions abroad. The trust accounts in Cyprus that showed wires toward Mallet's trustees were suddenly under review. Men started to twitch. Men like Haynes became liabilities they could cut. But the darker ones, the men who built the machine and never touched the levers, remained patient. They knew how to wait. Andre proposed a direct action. Hit the cash. Go get the drives before they could be destroyed. It was reckless, and it would require precision and brutality. The alternative was waiting for the machine to smother us in paperwork, erasure, and, possibly, in flesh. We had one chance to snap the cord that bound them, intercept the drives, and release them to multiple safe hosts at once. We scoped the cache location Haynes had given us, a private unit under the Mallet estate's care. The security was minimal to the point of arrogance. They relied on secrecy more than steel. That arrogance was our friend. The night we moved, we were a small Pharaoh unit. Me, Andre, and a quiet courier Lena trusted. Lena handled the legal noise and the press route in case we succeeded. We had flash drives, Faraday cages, a small crowbar, and a willingness that's hard to explain to people who still sleep warmed up. Breaking in was ugly. Steel groaned. Motion sensors complained. We moved fast, practiced the way men who have rehearsed 1,000 times move. The unit looked like a shrine to anonymity. Rows of drives, each labeled with names that read like tombstones. I remember the cold of the fluorescent lights, The smell of old plastic, the weight of the drives cramped in my jacket like a pulse. We loaded the first drive and left. On the way out, the world turned loud alarms, footsteps, the breath of men who had been thinking in certain legalities and now thought only to stop thieves. We were chased across a field like surly children at first, then like men being hunted. A single shot rang out, a bullet through the metal door. It whined past my ear and embedded itself in a crate behind us. We made it to the van with drives and with our breaths ripped out in the cold night. Someone had called. They'd escalated faster than we expected. The machine was not a slow predator. It was reactive and vicious. Back at Andre's safe house we uploaded copies, staggered releases across jurisdictions, and encrypted seeds across newsrooms and watchdogs. The drives were never going to be fully secure. Whatever we released would get chewed, rotated, suppressed by men with influence. But the redundancy mattered. If you plant 1,000 seeds, they can't choke them all. The truth can sprout in 12 courts and 100 archives. It's messy, but it's survivable. Within 24 hours, the world shifted under our feet. Headlines screamed about leaked drives, missing persons, and questionable charity flows. Haynes disappeared. Mallett's trustees fired lawyers who were dramatically worse at moral accounting than they were at paperwork. Men started distancing and denying. That's how you know you've hit them. When the comfortable go limp. Then the reprisal cut deeper. A man I'd only met once, a courier with a face like an errand, was found dead in a motel 2 counties over. The coroner's note was quiet, unknown cause, no signs of foul play at first glance. But our sources smelled the retribution in the air. Barton, Arkwright, one of them, had chosen to remind us what their work cost. We'd lit a war. The ledger burned at both ends. The truth was leaking into the bloodstream of the city, and the city's masters were ripping their own flesh to stop the infection. That night, as sirens spun somewhere far off and Lena whispered updates into a burner, Laura and I sat together on the stairs, the drives like cold lumps in the next room. She leaned on my shoulder in a way that suggested something like trust, a brittle thing rebuilt from necessity rather than from faith. We didn't sleep. We didn't talk much. We mapped the coming days like generals planning siege lines. If Part 4 had a lesson, it was this: exposing a machine doesn't end it. It enrages it. It takes your life and trades it for something larger, for an uneasy kind of justice that arrives in leaks and courtrooms and in the silence after a friend is found dead. The ledger didn't stop. It retaliated. It could still cut, but it had a weakness I could taste now. Men like Mallet grow fat on procedure. They forget the nimbleness of a small team with a moral point. We had drives, witnesses, and a journalist who would not be cowed. The next act would be decisive. It would be the move that either set the ledger alight or burned everything, including us. I thought about stepping back and letting the law do its work. I thought about disappearing to some place with no ledger and no history. I thought about forgiveness. I thought about killing Mallet with my bare hands if it came to it. In the end, I realized there was no clean ending, only the choices you live with. We had made our move. The cage had been rattled. Now we waited to see which bird would fly and which would break its wings against iron. They tell you in the profession that every operation has a closing frame, the moment the chaos resolves into something you can hold. I never believed that until I realized I'd been building a funeral for a system I once helped patch. The drives, the leaks, the vanished men, they were all scaffolding for the same truth, a ledger that bought silence and sold disappearance. Now the question was simple and brutal: would truth be enough to stop them? Or would our honesty be the match that burned the only things left to save? Weeks had passed since the raid on the cache. The city had split itself into 2 moods: the loud, performative outrage on the surface, and a cold, surgical fear behind the doors of men who'd always believed money and contacts could hold anything and place. The headlines had been a wave: public inquiries, a few arrests, brazen denials. But waves break and retreat. The ledger's owners had resources to build levees. That was the bad news. The good news, and the only thing that kept my hands from shaking, was that the drives contained names, timestamps, and transfer chains that could not be unmade by press statements. Copies were in multiple hands now, journalists in Stockholm and Geneva, a watchdog in Berlin, and in 3 legal teams who owed us favors in jurisdictions where men like Mallet couldn't pay for silent. The redundancy was deliberate. If they burned one record, another would glow up like embers in different courts. But redundancy doesn't protect the people in the ledger. It doesn't resurrect a courier found dead in a motel room, or the small men who'd been the visible body of a much older machine. It doesn't fix the fact that when you touch something built on corruption, the thing claws back. That claw came for Laura first. We thought we had made her safe enough after the cash, a false identity in a safe house, a plane booked under a friend's business name, a legal route through a witness program that would take months. She insisted on staying close. If I run, they win, she said. If I hide, they win. Her voice had the brittle clarity of someone making a last stand. I told her there were other choices. She chose to stand. On the morning the smug men in dark suits came for her, I was at a hearing where Lena gave testimony in a drizzle of legal detail that made senators uncomfortable. I'm ashamed to admit I watched the feed on my phone while the lawyers cross-examined evidence in far-flung rooms. My phone trembled in my hand when Andre sent a single line. They're moving on Laura, 20th Avenue. No law could move as fast as our enemies. No court could outrun a van and a closed gate. I left the hearing in a suit and tie, a legal phantom, and drove like a man trying to outrun his own blood. They had been efficient. To black SUVs, a badge flashed to a security guard, polite questions, and then rough hands. They took her from the safe house as if she were no more than a parcel with an inconvenient return address. They were clean practiced. The agency that moved them left no prints on the doorframe. They had the kind of efficiency that means government money and private benefactors. Marriage of bureaucracy and muscle. I followed in a different car, not close enough to be noticed but close enough to know the route. The convoy went to a private runway. A chartered jet waited like an angry wasp. The men loaded her into the plane with professional detachment. I watched her through a sedan's rear window, small, head bowed, and felt my control slip into the shape of rage. We had called every contact we could. Lawyers, prosecutors, journalists. Some scrambled. Some said the right words. Some said the wrong ones. We set traps in the legal system and in the press at the same time. Simultaneous releases that would pin down assets and freeze bank accounts. Subpoenas ready to deploy, and an international journalist who had promised to go live if the plane crossed into a certain airspace. Those were leverage points. The ledger was useful, but leverage is the work of people who can make time and motion intersect with law. I drove to the private runway and gathered what courage I had left. I watched as the plane taxied, as the men folded napkins and the pilot did pre-flight checks. For a moment, I thought about running across asphalt, screaming, making a scene. I'd reckoned with melodrama, with broken things acted out in public. Then I remembered Haynes' look. Small men become men who will do anything to survive. I had learned small, precise violence. I had also learned that sometimes the better blow is one delivered in paperwork and cameras, not with a gun. Andre's voice came through the earpiece. They'll take her to a non-extradition territory if we don't force the wing. Wait for the moment the manifest uploads. We can pin their path. Lena is going live. Moments like the one I needed are negotiations of timing. I called in the favors we promised one another. The German watchdog moved on a bank account with a coordinated subpoena. A Scottish regulator froze a trust. The plane's insurer called about an irregularity in clearance, and a notarized document filed seconds later flagged the jet as under investigation. It was enough to disrupt the chain. The pilot, used to smooth runs, radioed his owner. The men argued. The plane set. It was the first time I felt the shape of victory. Small, bureaucratic, legal. The sort of victory that costs you the swift poetry of a single decisive act but saves lives and leaves the ledger burning in the right rooms. They moved her to a holding room on a secondary tarmac. The men were bristling. Haynes and Mallet had a network larger than a rumor, but they weren't unstoppable. Someone in the bureaucracy still respected subpoenas when a dozen cameras were watching and 1,000 legal fingerprints were stamped across a contract. The world had teeth, slow teeth, but teeth nonetheless. The press arrived. Lena's live thread rolled. Cameras asked questions. Who authorized this flight? What client does the trust represent? A lawyer asked the men if they had proper clearances. The men stuttered. In that confusion, a prosecutor, who had been briefed by Lena and by our legal volunteers, approached. He'd had enough. Men with old money collared by law are almost always shocked. The prosecutor read a writ. He read it loudly. He read it in the face of men used to buying quiet. They argued until the sheriff took the writ and radioed for confirmation. I stood in the crowd and watched as their faces turned slack. The ledger had teeth, but the law had reach. We had placed the ledger with proof into hands that could make an instrument of it. Laura walked out of the jet under guard, not free, but in custody that would, in a country that respected courts, at least allow evidence to be useful. She met my eyes for a second, and in that second there was exhaustion, apology, and an impossible, private kind of love. I wanted to take her then, to collapse, to tell her that everything would be different. But different takes time. The ledger had burned. We had extinguished some of the flames. What followed was a tangle of hearings, depositions, and institutional panic. Mallet's people attempted to countersue, to claim defamation, to allege political manipulation. They threw money and legalese against us. But money and legalese are bad weapons when the world is watching and when documents are backed up across journalists and courts. They shot men into the press, spokespeople with rehearsed grief for the harassment of their clients, and people looked on, weirdly less convinced. Adversary narratives need coherence and secrecy. Leaking both is their death. There were losses, too. A courier who'd been a witness was found dead, officially natural causes, and we lost an important thread of human evidence. It was a reminder that the ledger's machine used people as currency, and that currency as cost. But the ledger's public unraveling had consequences. Men who'd been complacent were suddenly fragile. Bankers, who once smiled politely, began to attach moral certifications to their name like shields. It's ridiculous to hope institutions become saints because of pressure, but times change and pressure makes places rearrange. Raines and Rennick took the fall in staggered, public ways. Haynes flipped. Small men will always save themselves first if offered a better fate. He gave up names of trustees and contractors. Garrick Mallet tried to flee and failed when travel restrictions hit a shell company route. Men I'd never thought would bend did. It is comforting and nauseating both. Those who preach invulnerability have a breaking point. The ledger was read in courtrooms and in hearings and on the front pages of newspapers. It didn't heal everything. That's not how these things end. People who had been erased could not be unerased. Families remained crooked by grief, but the system's viable silence was under new scrutiny. Trust accounts froze. Charity boards resigned. Regulators wrote memos. For once, bureaucracy bent the knee to consequence. Tardy mean the present. I paid a price. The work I'd done to expose the ledger left me with enemies who would not forget. I left Grayson and Moore's old habits and found a life that had small joys and persistent ghosts. My nights were interrupted by strange cars and anonymous threats for months. I slept poorly. I learned to live with the idea that my life would always have a watchful tail. Laura and I, after the hearings and the long, ugly depositions, sat across a table with a lawyer and a counselor. We had a daughter, a fact I hadn't spoken of in the ledger's heat. During that time of leaks and accusations, she'd stayed with a sister far from danger. She was 7, made of sponge and light. The thought of her had been the single thing keeping me from becoming a monster. We tried to rebuild a relationship. It was clumsy and honest. Laura gave testimony about coercion and terror, about how small comforts had been traded for protection that turned into a chain. She spoke with a steadiness that surprised the court and me. She told the truth, not to make herself less culpable, but because truth mattered now in the places law and journalism could touch. We did not get a neat happy ending. That is not the point of a Ledger's fall. We got something harsher, a new frame for our lives. Some days we pretended it was enough. Some days it felt like ashdop. Months later, I taught a small class on ethics in security at the community college, a dull place for a man who once ran routes and jacked into servers, but precisely the place where I felt my work mattered. I taught students that systems corrupt when no one watches, and that the small choices of technicians can be the hinge between life and disappearance. I told them about chain of custody and about the thin moral fiber that keeps you from making a ledger your instrument. They asked good, angry questions. It was therapy of a kind. Lena kept writing. Andre kept fixing systems for clients who wanted cleaner practices. Our circle was smaller, but steadier. We remained watchful. Repercussions rippled out for years. Improved oversight on charities, new scrutiny on private security contractors, and a cautious distaste among some bankers for shells. The ledger's shadow was diminished, not vanquished. If there's a lesson I learned, and I learned it slowly and painfully, it is this: vengeance is not the same as justice. Fire can purge. It also burns what you meant to save. I had wanted to punish, to make men feel the law stayed ordered. In the end, my work was a different thing. It forced a system to be seen, and once seen, that system could be held accountable, poorly, slowly, imperfectly, but accountable. That is the best outcome we could have expected in a world where paper and silence had been the greatest sins. At night, sometimes, I pick up an old Polaroid of my daughter's face and the back of Laura's hand. We are both in the picture, smiling like fools. I do not pretend to forgive everything. I do not pretend to forget certain things. But I can say this: the ledger still sits in places where men will try again. That is why we made backups of the ledger copies, and why I keep them in secure, redundant locations. Because power loves forgetting. Truth is a stubborn thing when it has friends. We walked away from that winter with less trust and more truth. We had scars, and a daughter who liked to paint. The cost had been brutal, but the reckoning had been real. I still listen for the hum of men trying to make worlds disappear. I still plan contingencies. I still look at Laura sometimes and see the things she could not say without being punished. We are, in our small, expensive way, alive, and that is the ledger's last defeat. End of story.